Hey everyone, and welcome back to Every Day with Jesus. And we are continuing our study through the Sermon on the Mount. Today we're looking at Matthew chapter 6. We're going to be looking at verses 1 through 6 and verses 16 through 18. You'll notice that we're skipping over the Lord's Prayer today. Well, we're going to cover that tomorrow, and that's going to be a section by itself. But today, what we're going to be looking at is what is hypocrisy? And am I, as a Christian, am I guilty of hypocrisy? And beyond that, how do I avoid being a hypocrite in my own life? And I'm going to let you know that the answer here may surprise you. So, again, we're looking at Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 through 6, and verses 16 through 18. So I'm going to encourage you, go ahead and pause this video, turn there in your Bible, and read through that passage, and then we'll look at it piece by piece. So Jesus begins, he's still speaking to his disciples, still where the crowds can hear him. Remember that he told them that they're the light of the world and that their life has to be lived at a higher standard, even than the scribes and the Pharisees, not just an outward righteousness, but an inward righteousness that they have to have as well. And so he begins to warn them then about some of the things. He's been talking to them about this is what you should do. And now he's going to kind of switch and say, and here's some of the things you should not do. And so he says in chapter 6, verse 1, beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them. For then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. Now, this may, if you've been paying attention, it might hit you a little sideways that Jesus would say this, because just a chapter ago, and back in Matthew chapter 5, verse 16, he said that we are the light of the world and that we should let our light shine in order that people may see our good deeds and give glory to our Father who's in heaven. And so you might look at this and you go, wait a minute, you're telling me here in chapter 6 not to do my works to be seen by others. And in chapter 5, you were saying that we should live in such a way that people do notice our good works. So which is it? Should our works be noticed or not? But it's not so much, Jesus' point is that it's not so much about whether other people notice your works. Clearly he expects that people will notice a difference in the lives of Christians and of people who are not Christians. But rather the question is really about who gets the glory, who receives the honor from what's done. Are people glorifying you for the things you do, or does it make them want to glorify God? And so Jesus is going to give some examples. And he's going to use this word that's thrown around a lot in our culture, and it's hypocrite. Look what he says in verse 2. He says, thus when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets. See, now that right here, that they may be praised by others. Not so people will glorify God, but so people will glorify them. And so you've probably heard people use this word hypocrite before. And sometimes they use this, and sometimes what people mean when they say hypocrite is they'll say, well, a hypocrite is someone who preaches one thing, but they don't live it out. Well, let me ask you a question. I don't expect you to answer. But if I was to say, as Christians, we should strive to live lives without sin. Well, does that mean that I always strive to live a life without sin? Well, the reality is sometimes I'm better about it than others. Does that automatically make me a hypocrite? No. People can believe in standards that they themselves don't always live up to. If I was to say as a Christian, we shouldn't lie. You say, well, Michael, have you ever lied? Well, of course I have lied, but I shouldn't lie. I hopefully am... Nobody has any, I haven't lied in any time in the recent past. But the reality is yes, that's not hypocrisy. Hypocrisy actually comes from a term in the theater. And in Greek theater, people would wear like concrete masks. Typically, only men acted, and so they would wear these concrete masks to show who they were as different characters. And so when they wanted to be a woman, they just put on the woman mask, and when they wanted to be, a god or something, they would put on that mask, and so people would know who the character was that they were portraying. And so Jesus says, and these people were, the same word, hypocrites, right? Play actors. And so Jesus is basically saying about the Pharisees, he's like, they're just putting on a show. They're pretending to be something that they're not. But really, it's a performance. It's a performance for the people to see. And that's what hypocrisy is. Hypocrisy isn't if I believe something, but I don't always live up to it. No, I mean, that's all of us, really. Hypocrisy really is if I'm pretending to be something just for you when I should be doing it for God. And so Jesus says that when the scribes give to the needy, he says, or when they give in the synagogues, he said they sound a trumpet before them. Now, literally, this doesn't mean that they would have a real trumpet and they would blow it and say, hey guys, I'm about to give to the needy. I'm about to give to the synagogue. Actually, what a lot of people believe this means is that there were metal containers where contributions would be dumped into. And since all the money was coin money in the Roman Empire, then they would have these large boxes of coins and they would dump them into these metal containers. And of course, this would resound through the whole synagogue, through the temple courts, if that's where they were. And people would see this and they would go, oh, look who it is giving all this money. And so Jesus, this kind of became a euphemism to say, well, they're blowing their trumpet in their giving. And so the issue here really is, what is our motivation? See, Jesus, the first place that he says Christians need to be very careful about is he said we need to be careful in our generosity. We need to be careful not to necessarily draw attention to ourselves in our giving. And look what he says here in verses 3 or 4. He says, but when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. He says the Pharisees, they received their reward when they received the praise for the people. He said, so don't do it for them. He says, do it for God. And one kind of analogy that I like to give to people, or I guess illustration of this point, is I said, if someone came to you, you were going through a very difficult time financially, and they just said, you know what, I know you're going through a really hard time. I'm going to go ahead and I've got $1,000 right here, and I'm just going to hand you $1,000 cash. You would say, oh, wow. And what would your immediate response would be, thank you so much. This really helps us out. We're going through such a hard time, and this is just such a blessing to us. But imagine if instead of a person coming up and handing you the money, you just went to go get your mail one day, and there inside the mailbox, there was $1,000 in cash, and you didn't know who it came from. No one said anything, just maybe a note in there say, hey, we know you're going through a hard time. We just wanted to help out. God bless you. You might give thanks, but your immediate your immediate response would probably be to give thanks to God and say, God, look, I don't know who did this, but thank you so much for making this, because we're struggling and we're going. And do you see the difference there? Now, that doesn't mean you can't ever give anyone money or anything like that, but it means that we should try to do things in such a way that God receives the glory instead of us receiving the glory, because Jesus says if you receive the glory, you've gotten your reward. Don't expect a reward from God for doing those things, because you already received the reward when the people praised you. He also points to another area of our life, and that is how religious we are. He says, and verse 5, when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites. Again, they're the ones putting on the show. For they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at street corners, that they may be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. And again, we can fall into this trap about how religious we are, about how much, bragging about how much of the Bible we know, or what conferences we've been to, or how long it's been since we've missed church. I haven't missed a church service in 5 years before this pandemic hit. Oh, okay. I don't need to know that. Is that for the Lord, or is that for me to say, oh, wow, wonderful, thank you so much, that's amazing. Sometimes we want to brag about how much time we spend in prayer or Bible study, or how many Bible studies we attend. But Jesus says that our religion shouldn't be like that. Not that we need to be ashamed of it. That's not the point. He says, but rather, we should always be doing it as a way to please God. And I remember one time someone asked, they said, why do you go to church? What's the reason you go to church? And a lot of people gave answers like, well, I just love the worship. I love the sermon. I love the way it makes me feel. But I think the best answer really is because God is worthy of our glory. He's worthy of our worship and our praise. And so it's not really about us. It's all about Him. And Jesus says that's what our Christian life should be about. It should be about bringing glory to God. And so He says, when you pray, verse 6, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees you in secret will reward you. So He says, so when you give generously, but give secretly. When you're praying and when your relationship with God, He says that should be a very private thing. Not that we shouldn't share our faith, right? But we shouldn't ever be doing it so people focus their attention on us. And this is finally in verse 16 through 18. He says, and when you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces, that their fasting may be seen by others. Now it was, I'll continue on. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. Now, it's believed, based on some other things that Jesus says, is that the Pharisees commonly would fast twice a week, but they wanted people to know how much they were fasting. And so they knew, like, just not eating for a day, people aren't going to necessarily be able to physically see a difference between you. Just so they know that we're fasting, we need to make sure to have our face look like it's, inset, and, we need to look hungry. And so people will know how devoted we are. And I find that this happens in churches a lot. We'll talk a lot about our sacrifices and how much we're sacrificing, how committed we are. And we want people to know that. You go to the person at the Vacation Bible School, you're bringing your kids there, and you go to one of the booths and you say, hey, how you doing? They say, oh, well, I'm doing okay, but I've been here since 6 o'clock this morning getting this set up, and we have not stopped working all day long. We first got everything set up, and then we had to get our snacks prepared, and we had to run out. And I actually had to spend $80 of my own money just to help out with this Vacation Bible School. And you see how this goes, right? I want you to know about how dedicated I am, how devoted I am, about the sacrifices that I make for this church and for God. And you should really appreciate that. You should recognize that I'm a very special spiritual person. And maybe we don't always think about it that way, but the reality is Jesus says that once you make that statement, that you're putting on the show. You're showing them. You are trying to get the glory for yourself. And you say, well, then how do I do this? Well, let's continue to read these few verses and then we'll talk about it. He says, but when you fast, anoint your head, wash your face, so that your fasting may not be seen by others, but, again, by your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Now, if I was to ask, what is the one word that you see repeated over and over and over again in this passage? It's that word, secret. In other words, shut up, right? Keep it shut. Nobody needs to know about how often you pray. Nobody needs to know about how much you give. And nobody needs to know about the sacrifices that you make. And really, those things, the Bible's going to tell us, are an act of faith. Do I really believe when I do these things that God sees and He will reward me? But once you open your mouth and you tell someone about what you've done, or you do it just so they can see it, Jesus said you've lost any reward you were going to have. God is not going to reward you for that. It's not a both end. You could hold on to that and save it up for God to reward you for it, or you can cash it in right then and get glory from the people. But the reality is that we are not, as Christians, living for our own glory. We're not living for our own praise. We're living for Jesus. God bless you guys. I look forward to having you tomorrow.